A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Thomas. A man said to Jesus, "Tell my brother to divide my father's possessions with me." He said to him, "Who has made me a divider?" He turned to his disciples and said to him, "I'm not a divider, am I?" Jesus says, "The crop is huge, but the workers are few. So beg the harvest boss to dispatch workers to the fields." Jesus says, "There are many around the drinking trough, but there is nothing in the well." Jesus says, "There are many standing at the door, but it is the solitary one who will enter the bridal chamber." Jesus says, "The kingdom of the Father is like a merchant who had a consignment of merchandise and who discovered a pearl. That merchant was shrewd. He sold the merchandise and he bought the pearl alone for himself. You too seek this unfailing and enduring treasure where no moth comes near to devour and no worm destroys." Jesus says, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there." Jesus says, "Why have you come out into the countryside? To see a reed shaken by the wind? Or to see a person dressed in soft clothes like the rulers and your powerful ones? They are dressed in soft clothes, and they cannot understand truth." A woman from the crowd said to him, "Blessed are the womb that bore you and the breast that nurtured you." He said to her, "Blessed are those who have heard the word of the Father and have truly kept it. For there will be days when you will say, 'Blessed are the wombs which have not conceived and the breasts which have not given milk.'" A word inspired by God. Analyze that. Any of you seen that movie? Oh, no. Yeah? Analyze that. Yeah? It's a very funny movie starring Billy Crystal. Billy Crystal plays the part of a Jewish psychiatrist who bumps into a mafia boss. Literally, he bumps into a mafia boss. He's driving downtown, totally distracted, and he crashes into the car in front of him, and the boot pops up. What do you call a boot here? The trunk. The trunk pops up, and there's a dead body inside in the trunk. And the guy driving the car is a mafia boss, played by Robert DeNiro. And he's really, really anxious. Obviously, he's been discovered. And it winds up, Billy Crystal becomes his therapist and has to travel around with him everywhere. And there's one very funny scene in which, because the mafia boss, De Niro, as a mafia boss, is a good Catholic, and he goes to church. And he's going into a church, and there's a big stone holy water font out in front, and he goes in, dips his hand and blesses himself and proceeds. And Billy Crystal, this Jewish psychiatrist, is coming after him. He can't see what he's doing, just sees his hand going into this water thing, and he comes up to himself and he figures out it's a really hot, muggy day, so he goes, starts shooting himself with the water. Now, the question I ask myself is, who was more blessed by the water? The mafia boss or Billy Crystal? And I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about water specifically today. And I'm going to make 5 main points. The first one I will call water, the story of evolution. And then I'm going to talk about cross-cultural blessings that use water. And then I'm going to talk about the water symbolism in baptism. Then I'm going to talk about blessing itself. What does blessing mean? Then finally I'm going to talk about the H2O live concert. I don't know if you've heard of it or not. And my 5th point. So the first one is water, the story of evolution. Our little planet is about 75% water. The surface of our planet, 75% of it is covered with water. Human beings are more than 80% water. All living things are consist basically of water and a few other trace minerals, but basically of water. So you could really say that the history of evolution on our planet is literally the history of water. The first creatures that evolved on the planet evolved in water, single-celled bacteria. And then at some stage, real water animals developed. And at some stage, they started to try out dry land. What would that be like? The amphibians who came out and went back between the water and the dry land. But most of the amphibians, when it came time to birthing their young, they went straight back into the water and they birthed their young in the water. And they still do it today. Frogs are a typical amphibian. Although they live a lot of their time on dry land, when it comes time to birth their young, they go straight back into the water. So there's the memory that we come from water, and they go right back there. Now, when the mammals evolved eventually, they did one better. Instead of having to go back into the water to birth their young, they took the water with them. They created oceans inside themselves, the females of the species, what we call the womb, the amniotic fluid. And so now, instead of having to go back into the water to conceive their young and to birth their young, the mammals have learned how to conceive and birth their young in the ocean on dry land. And so we took the ocean with us. So literally you could say that the story of evolution is the story of water. Basically, human beings are water that has learned how to think. And I'm not being facetious. We are basically water that has learned how to think. And so the history of water for me is the history of evolution. It is the history of the spirit using this medium called water to become more and more self-aware until we've arrived at a stage where water is able to think. Unfortunately, that's not a good place to be. When you get thinking allied to greed, you get the technology of global destruction. And so the evolution has to continue. The evolution of water has to continue. We have to become beings not just who are water thinking, we have to become beings who are water souling. The soul has to become part of who we are. It has to be water ensouled rather than water just thinking. This is where we need to go. So I'm totally convinced that if you want to know the history of the evolution of our planet, look at how water is evolving, and there you see the trajectory. And the trajectory has to be that we become ensouled water and not merely thinking water. That's the first point I'll make. Second point is this. I want to look then at the cross-cultural water blessings that you find all over the world. And I just mentioned just 4 of them. And the first one is the symbolism that Jesus employed at the Last Supper. The first act of the Last Supper wasn't Eucharist. The first act of the Last Supper was the washing of the feet of his disciples. Now, there's many different kinds of symbolism attached here. You could say that he's cleansing the dust of the road from the safari they'd been on. But that, for me, that's not the primary symbolism. It's not about cleansing. It is that Jesus was really grounding his disciples in the basic element of life. Before he begins Eucharist and before he commissions them, he wants to ground them completely in the stuff of life. He washes their feet, so he wants to put them in fullest possible earthed contact with the primary source of all life. And then they will become the well springs for life to spring up for the human community. So that's the symbol that Jesus uses. The very first one in the Last Supper is the washing of the feet of the disciples. So that's one culture. I look at the Irish culture, and certainly when I was growing up as a small child, in every Irish household, inside the front door, on the left or the right, depending on which way the door was opening, there was always a little holy water font. And before you left the house, you had to dip your hand and you had to bless yourself before you went on any kind of a trip. And in some households, there was somebody who did it for you. My grandmother was the designated blesser in our family. And before any child left the house, she would dip her hand in and she would sprinkle water on them. You would never be allowed to leave the house without being blessed with holy water. So there was an Irish form of the blessing. Islam, when a Muslim is about to pray, there's a very elaborate washing ritual that takes place. The feet, the face, the ears, the nose, even the nostril are washed before you can begin to pray. You need to be somehow cleansed and put in contact with the water stuff. So within Islam, the water symbolism is really important. But the most powerful of all I've come across was among the Kalenjin people in Africa. So the Kalenjin were nomadic pastoralists who had been forcibly settled down, but basically they were pastoralists. And because they lived pretty much in the desert areas of Kenya, the sun was very important to them, but most important of all was water. So to have saliva in your mouth was a sign that you were still alive. So the first thing a Kalenjin did in the morning, when he came out of his tent or out of his hut, wherever he was living, he would come out and spit on both palms and offer it to the sun. And it was a symbol that he was alive, and he was offering the blessing back to the sun, which gave him life, and the water that showed that he was alive. Now, I was aware of that when I went there first. But then, after a while, I moved to another group of people called the Nandi. They're a subgroup of the Kalenjin, and I was learning the Nandi language. And I was living in a little village, and one day I was walking, and I came across this old man, a total stranger to me, as I was to him, and he stopped, and we tried to chat. I only had broken Nandi at that stage, and he wanted to know who I was. And as soon as he found out who I was, all of a sudden, he spat in my face. And I was totally shocked, really, really upset. I had no idea what was happening. So I go back to the mission, and there's an older priest there who's been many, many years, and I tell him what happened. And he says, yes, he was blessing you. It was literally a blessing. It wasn't a sign of approbation, it was a total blessing. So I remember that very, very well. And subsequently, when I was living with another group of Kalenjin people, a group called the Kipsigis, one day I got a call to go to a woman who'd been in labour for 3 days, living way, way in the bush. And she wanted to get transported to the hospital because she was afraid she was going to lose the baby. And by the time the husband got to the mission, miles and miles and miles and miles away, and the two of us drove back in my Jeep, we arrived at the household, and the baby had been born and was very obviously dead. And everybody is standing around really, really, really upset. And so it's obvious to the mother and to everybody else the little baby has died. And the mother finally said to me, would you baptize him? I said, sure. Can you get me some water? There was literally not a drop of water in the house. Not a drop of water in the house. So I did what the Nandi man had told me what to do. I took the baby in my arms and I spat on him 3 times in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So therefore the Nandi and the Kipsigis and the Tugan was a different form of water and a different form of blessing. So right across culturally, water has been an extraordinary symbol of life and love and blessing for everybody. Which brings me to my third point. I looked then at the symbolism in the baptismal rite as it's evolved in the Catholic Church. And we've done many baptisms here in this church over the years, so you're familiar with the dialogue of it. There's one part of the ceremony which is the blessing of the water. Before we baptize the baby, there is a blessing for the water itself. And it talks about how water is a rich symbol you have given us. And it mentions 5 different aspects of the symbolism. It says, it's a symbol of the waters of creation, when God parted the waters and dry land came out and the Spirit breathed on the waters. So water is a symbol of the beginning of the world itself, the very creation that's used in the baptismal ceremony. And then it says, waters are the symbol of the great flood, which destroyed life on the planet and only saved 8 people. When I think of this, however, I have a totally different hit on it. It is not that water destroyed everything because it's destructive and it's hateful and it's evil. But water is Shiva energy, to use a Hindu kind of a phrase. In Hinduism, the Trinity in Hinduism is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is creator God, Vishnu is sustaining God, and Shiva is destructive God. But destructive only in this sense, that God likes to reconfigure her creation constantly. God is never totally satisfied with the status quo. She is always reconfiguring. And so Shiva energy is the ability to disassemble the pieces and recreate them in a different configuration. It's like a little boy with a Lego set. He gets a pile of Lego and he creates a skyscraper out of it. And he's happy with the skyscraper for a day and a half, and then he trashes it. And he takes all the same pieces and he builds a super tanker out of it, using all of the same elements but in a different combination. That is Shiva energy. And that is the energy of water. It constantly recreates and reconfigures its own designs. And that's what the flood is about. It's not about destruction and wiping out what is. It's about creating new possibilities. And that's symbolized in the water of baptism as well. The third symbol that they use in the baptismal ceremony is the symbol of the Israelites going through the Red Sea. And the water passed to the right and to the left, and they passed through dry shod. Now, for me, that is not a sign of God's partisanship, that God favored the Jews and then killed the Egyptians who came on afterwards. Not about that. It's the fact that spirit and nature and evolution will always bless any movement towards freedom. Any movement that's seeking freedom, any group of people people that's seeking freedom, any individual that's seeking freedom from whatever source, whether it's from religious dogma, or it's from economic hegemony, or it's from political oppression. Whenever a person, an individual, a community, or a species is seeking freedom, nature will open up the path to it. Nature works for freedom constantly. And anything which is moving towards freedom, because freedom looks like enlightenment, anything that's moving towards freedom, nature will respond and correspond and align with it and open up the path for it. That's what's symbolized by the Red Sea, as far as I'm concerned. Then the fourth symbol in baptism was that when Jesus was dying on the cross, that blood and then water flowed from his side. Now, what does that mean for me? It means that literally Jesus Christ was fertilizing the planet with the water of Christ consciousness. This wasn't just that an exhausted being was finally giving up the last piece of liquid in his system. It wasn't about that. It was that Jesus Christ was fertilizing the very planet with the waters of Christ consciousness. And then finally, at the Last Supper, Jesus commissions his disciples to go out and to baptize all people in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. And again, we've misunderstood this, of course. This is what he was not commissioning them to go out and to induct people into an organization, membership of which is necessary in order to be saved. It's not about organizations and it's not about salvation. It's about the recognition that there is only water, that there is only love, and that there is only one of us. So baptism in water is not induction into a special club that guarantees you salvation at the end of time. It's the realization that there is nothing except water. There is nothing except life. There is nothing except love, and there is only one of us. So these are the symbols that we use in the baptism. But of course, like all symbols, we misunderstand. We take every single one of them and we use them for partisanship reasons. But this is how they evolved in the symbolism as properly understood, it seems to me. Which brings me to my fourth point. I'm going to talk about the nature of blessing itself. For most people, when they think about blessing, so if I were to come down as a priest and I was to take this bread here and I would say, do a sign like this over it, it seems like I am taking a previously inert substance, a piece of bread, and I am conferring or imparting some kind of benediction to it. That's what most people think blessing is. And of course, that's not blessing at all. Blessing, much more accurately, is that I recognize the inherent blessedness of everything that is, and I celebrate that ritualistically. I'm not imparting to a previously inert substance something that it didn't previously have. I'm recognizing its inherent sanctity, and I'm honoring it in some kind of a ritual. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. When I was meditating this morning, I finally got it that even that needs to be tweaked a little bit. Because nothing exists in a neutral state, or nothing exists in a totally blessed state. Everything exists, rather, in a state of possibility, and a state of potential, and a state of becoming. And so blessing really, I began to understand this morning, is not so much that I recognize the inherent blessedness of something, it is that there is a dance that happens between the partners, and it is the dance that calls forth a particular facet of any substance. It is the dance that will bring forth either the shadow in me or the light in me. And this happens, as I see, right throughout the cosmos. There is a dance that's happening in our cosmos between 200 billion galaxies, all of whom are dancing together and inviting from each other the light. And it depends on how the dance goes, whether it's light that gets pulled to the surface or it's darkness that gets pulled to the surface. The same thing happens within our galaxy itself. In our galaxy, there are about 150 billion solar systems. Our little solar system is wrapped in what's called a heliosphere. There literally is an atmosphere around our solar system, just like there is around our planet. So the entire system travels as a unit through the galaxy, wrapped in a membrane, which is called the heliosphere. But the very galaxy itself pulsates. There's no scientific evidence that there's a heartbeat to our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. It's a pulse beat that takes 12,000 years to beat. And when it beats, it sends out cosmic rays that impinge upon the solar systems and the heliospheres, penetrates them, and influences their behavior. And so literally, the galaxy itself has a heartbeat, inviting from our solar system, as it invites from other solar systems, particular kinds of responses. You look within our particular little planetary system, our solar system. There are 9 planets in attendance. Every single one of these planets exercises an influence on the other planets. If one of them were to be taken out of the equation suddenly, the whole system would go into chaotic behavior, because we're holding each other in this extraordinary, elegantly choreographed dance. All of them are depending on each other for their movement. You look at our planet itself, there are about 10 million different species of life on our planet. They need each other. They're dancing together in symbiosis, in cooperation, and in competition. And depending on the face that one species offers to another, it depends what the other species, how it can respond, what's going to come through. Will it be competition or will it be cooperation? When we look just at the human species itself, we see that intercommunities or internationally, the behavior of one community or the behavior of one nation influences what the response of another nation and another community is going to be. So blessedness has to do with the dance that takes place between us. The same thing happens in interpersonal dynamics. When two people are relating, depending on how the dance is going, I'm going to draw a response of love from you and light from you, or a response of darkness from you, depending on how I'm doing the dance myself. And even intrapsychically, as I dance with myself, as the sub-personalities within me dance their dance, they're going to call forth a personality which is filled with light or is going to be filled with darkness. And so I got it this morning. That blessing is a little bit more complicated. It's not just the imparting of benediction to a previously inert substance, and it's not just the recognition of the inherent blessedness. It is the realization that there is light and there is dark in everything. And it is the dance that determines which comes to the surface, the light or the dark. When light dances with light, then there is love produced. When dark dances with dark, then there is evil produced. Now when light dances with light, there is more light. Light can dance with darkness, and that gives us perspective. But when darkness dances with darkness, there is pure evil comes out. And since all of us have light and darkness within us, it depends on the dance. The dance determines what comes through. Great leaders are people who can dance out the light of a culture into its public behavior. Evil leaders, leaders unto darkness, are people who create a kind of a dance which brings forward from the culture the darkness and the evil inherent in any culture. That's the only difference between the criminal and the avatar, is the reconfiguration of the pieces and how they choose to make the dance. Which brings me to my final point. I call it H2O live concert. There is an extraordinary Japanese scientist called Dr. Masaru Emoto. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, who has experimented with water crystals. And what he's discovered is that you can impregnate water. You can dance with water in such a way that you can affect its crystallization process. So he's taken water from sewers in Japan, and he's taking water from sacred places in Japan, and he's exposed them to different kinds of music and different kinds of sounds and different kinds of intentionality, and then photographed the crystalline structure of the waters. And there's a very beautiful illustrated book of these photographs. And what you see is that depending on how water has been danced with, depending on how water has been treated, depending on how water has been related to, depending on the intentionality of people interfacing with water, the crystalline structure is totally different. Some of them are really gunky and dark looking crystals, and some of them are totally vibrant and alive, depending sometimes on the source. But even when it comes from a polluted source, are related to or danced with in such a way that it will change its crystalline structure. Now, today at 5 p.m., today is the summer solstice, and today at 5 p.m., beginning in Laguna Beach in California, an extraordinary ritual is going to start. I don't know if any of you have read about it. They call it the H2O live concert. There will be about 10 million people involved worldwide in it. And what they're doing is they're trying to impregnate water with the frequency of love. Now, one of the things that Emoto found out is that everything obviously has frequencies. Everything in the universe is basically energy, so it's vibrating at different frequencies. And the frequency that inspires the most beautiful kind of crystalline structure in water is a frequency of 528 hertz for some reason. 528 cycles per second. That frequency creates love and creates water structure which is extraordinarily beautiful. So musicians beginning in Laguna Beach, California, today at 5 p.m., and for the next 72 hours around the globe, they're going to create a wave literally a wave, at that frequency, to try to impregnate the waters of the planet with the love of human beings, to see if they can affect global peace in this way. So they will begin the chant at 5 p.m. today. Hundreds of musicians, recording artists, scientists, healers gathered in Lagunas Beach, and it will spread. Firstly, they will impregnate the Pacific Ocean with it, and will travel across to Japan, will be taken up on that side, and travel across Asia, into India, into the Middle East, into Africa and Europe, then across the Atlantic and across the continental United States back here. And the cycle will take 90 minutes, and it will be repeated for the next 72 hours at that frequency. Now, the basic stuff of the world is love, and the basic solvent of the world is water. You put water and love together, and then you have the possibility of a global baptism. Maybe for the first time ever in human history, we have the opportunity of participating in a global, literally a global baptism. Not a flood induced by hurricanes, but a flood from human love, from the soul of the human species. So I invite you to think about it wherever you are at 5 o'clock today, or for the next 72 hours. If you're by a creek, or water, or get into your bathtub, or turn on your faucet, or fill your mouth with water and gargle, I don't care what you do. Try today or sometime over the next 72 hours to be part of a global baptism in which love is the message and water is the medium.